Okay. We're going to continue this morning a series that will be the last one of the Jesus season before Good Friday and Easter this year that is focused on something called parables, which are these stories with a spiritual point that Jesus told. And we're doing this with the branch church, so you only get me half of the Sundays. These stories have the notoriety of being stories you can only find in the Gospel of Luke, which is the gospel that we as a church are reading through this year for the Jesus season. I should tell you that in this series, Pastor Chris of the branch and I chose to leave some of the most famous parables out, like neither of us are going to talk about the prodigal son this year, which you only find in the Gospel of Luke. And what we did instead is each of us chose a lesser-known parable or a harder one. You heard his last week. You get to hear mine today. And I don't mind telling you this is also one of my favorite. Jesus doesn't really, when we encounter this story in the Gospel of Luke chapter 16, there's not a lot of lead-in to it, so I'm not going to give you a lot of lead-in to it. I want you to encounter the story or hear it the way that his audience did. All that we know about this story and the setting for it is Jesus, as was common, was teaching to a mixed crowd. There were those who were his followers or his disciples already and had committed their life to trying to live in his way. There were lots of people who were just interested in him and what he had to say because he was that compelling and interesting of a figure. And then there were also his enemies in the crowd who were listening, hoping he would say something that they could use against him. And it is to this motley crew, this mixed bag of people, that Jesus launches into this story unprompted. And I'm going to try to do this for you fairly quick because I want you to kind of hear it the way that his audience would have. So I'm going to add a few interpretive comments along the way, but not a whole lot else. Jesus said to his followers there in the crowd, "Once there was a rich man who had a manager that took care of his business." How rich of a man this is, we'll get to in a minute. This manager is an employee of his. If this were a story that was told in a Greek or a Roman setting, then in this day it could have been a slave. But given that it was a Jewish setting, this is an employee, very much like a general manager of a business today. This rich man had a manager who was taking care of his business and his assets. This manager was, quote, squandering, unquote, the rich man's business. Now this word implies two things: that the guy was bad at his job, so he was wasting the rich man's business or squandering it away. But second, he was doing it because he was dishonest. So maybe a more modern translation of this word would be that this manager was embezzling the man's business. And if he had been tried in a court of law, would have been thrown in prison for what he was doing. So the rich man called the manager in and, as you would expect, "What's this I hear about you? Give an account of my money right now because no longer can you work for me." That is, he's getting his pink slip. The manager is about to get fired. The manager thought to himself, what will I do now that I'm losing my job? I'm not strong enough to dig ditches, and I'm too ashamed to beg. Wait, I'll know what I'll do, so that then after I'm terminated, people will welcome me into their homes. Let me just go ahead and pause and say this guy's obviously a white-collar worker, right? He's too proud, we're not strong enough to dig ditches, and he won't beg on the streets. So he throws his hands up in the air and says, "I have no idea what to do," and then he lands on something. And so the manager called in everyone who had an outstanding debt to this rich man or who had an unpaid invoice for his business. And here we're going to get two examples of what he did. To the first person who came in, he said, "How much do you owe?" And the amount was 900 gallons of olive oil. And so the manager said, "I tell you what, take your bill, sit down, scratch out 900 and write 450. Now, that doesn't mean a lot to you on the page, okay? Because if you bought 450 gallons of olive oil, I have no idea why you would do that. I'm sure Costco would sell it to you for $29.99 and you'd be done with it. Let me help you understand the monetary value of this, okay? 900 gallons of olive oil in Jesus' day was worth about 1,000 denarii, which is a day's wages. So about 3 years' worth of wages. So the modern equivalent in America right now of 3 years' wages for the typical family is that the total bill was $165,000. And the manager said, tell you what, why don't you just scratch that out and write $80,000 instead. Here's the next example. The next guy comes in, or the next debtor who owes the business comes in, and the bill reads 1,000 bushels of wheat. And the manager says to him, well, hey, I tell you what, take your bill, scratch out the 1,000, write in 800. Again, let me help you monetize that amount in modern terms. 1,000 measures of wheat is 100 measures of wheat is the same thing as 1,000 bushels of wheat, which is the equivalent of the yield of 100 acres of farmland, which is the monetary value of 2,500 to 3,000 denarii, or days' wages, which is 8 or 9 years' pay. So for the typical average family in America this year, you're talking about $500,000. $550,000 is what 1,000 bushels of wheat is. And so when the manager said, tell you what, why don't you go ahead and write 80 instead, or 800 instead, he's whacking 20% off of that, which is about $100,000. This is not a little money we're talking about. These two examples, by the way, are meant to tell us that he probably did this with every debtor, not just the two that Jesus mentions in the story. And I've got to tell you, some scholars who interpret this passage have a real hard time with it, and they try to justify the guy's behavior. They say, well, maybe he's cutting down the interest payment, or maybe he's cutting his commission payment off of it. No, remember, this is an embezzler. What he's doing here is it's exactly what you think it is. He is cutting down the bill owed, or the debt owed. Now, I want you to pause, because we're almost to the end of this story. Now, if you've heard this before, play along. I would like you to guess, please, how Jesus ends the parable. So you have a dishonest manager who has built his boss out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. How do you think the story ends? Okay, you got it in your head? Yeah, this is how the story ends. So the rich man praised the dishonest manager for his cleverness. May I express to you in emojis the response of the crowd that day to this parable. What? Are you kidding me that this is the point of the parable? Now you can tell why I love it so much, right? And why I think some other people do too. Now, it does have your attention though, right? That Jesus tells this story about white-collar crime. All of a sudden, that's the end of it. Well, here's the good news. As is often the case, Jesus doesn't leave us to guess what we're supposed to do with the story. He will almost, more often than not, when he tells a parable, he'll also tell you what you're supposed to get from it. And in this case, there are three things that he's going to talk about immediately after this parable that he wants us, his audience, to take away from it. You might say they are three basic principles about money and assets that he is trying to pass along to everyone who was listening that day. We're going to touch on all three, which means we can't cover any one with that much depth. There are things you can do this week, though, that will help you personalize it even more, and I hope that you do. There are some purple half sheets on your chairs and tables that you can take with you that will help you work with this a little more. There's also a devotional that the branch church has written for this passage and this message that you can take with you, and you can read that and see what that writer has to say. That is over on the table at the back of the worship area. Here are the 3 points that Jesus says we ought to take from this very strange, really it's a unique parable. It's the only time Jesus puts this kind of twist at the end of a parable like this. Number 1 is this. It is what comes out of Jesus' mouth immediately after telling the story. Yes, Jesus says, worldly people are more clever in their relationship with others than the sons of light, or that is, God's children often are. I tell you, make friends for yourselves with unrighteous wealth, so that, when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. This, whatever we could say about the dishonest manager in the parable, this is what that guy got right. And this is why Jesus ended the parable the way that he did. If you wanted to say what that set of verses is trying to communicate in a very simple way, it might be this. Money fails, people don't. Invest accordingly. What the white-collar criminal in that story did is he decided to do something that admittedly was highly illegal, but he did something monetary that had a relational effect. His plan was, if I help these people with their outstanding large bills, then they will take care of me after I lose my job. That's the wager that he makes. And that is what Jesus says we ought to do if we're going to imitate the point of what Jesus is trying to communicate in the story. Money fails, people don't. So invest accordingly. And maybe even more to the point, use your assets and your money to invest in people. Because the latter tends to be far more reliable than the former. Let me change the way perhaps you think about giving to church. I'm sure all of you who call our church home, to the extent that you feel able and led, support our church financially. You write a check every month, or you have an automatic deduction from your checking account or your savings account, and we appreciate that. Oftentimes when we think about giving to church, we think about that in terms of paying the staff, or paying the rent, keeping the lights on, etc. What if you thought about what you're doing this way? What you're doing is taking part of what you have, part of your assets, part of what you've earned, and you're choosing to invest it in people. What people? These people. The people you go to church with, the people you sit with, the people you're in a small group with, the people who laugh with you, the people who support you, the people who encourage you, the people who you know will be gracious and kind to a friend that you bring to our church who may not be comfortable anywhere else. Yeah, those people. What you do every time you choose to support this church or any church, I hope, is you are making a material investment in people, just like Jesus said you ought to. You're investing in a community of neighbors who have committed together to live like good neighbors toward each other and to the neighbors they have around them in their life. And maybe you're like me, at this point in my life, that's priceless. There is nothing more important than having a group of people who are like-minded about the most important things, i.e. that. That's what you do when you give. But you see, as a family or as individuals, you can use this principle in very concrete ways. This week, you could take time and go, wow, all right, so here's how much money I make a month. Here are the hard assets that I have. I have a home. I have a couple of cars. I have a motorcycle. I have a summer cottage. I have a boat. I have a timeshare. These are the assets that I have that in God's eyes I am a steward of. I'm supposed to manage well for his sake and the sake of his kingdom. What could I do with those to put this principle into practice? That I will take the material things I have and I'm going to choose to invest some of it in people, because people are far more important and reliable and stable than money is. Maybe you offer a week at your cottage this summer to a friend you know who can't afford it. And you say, you know what? Come, spend a week there with your family. Have some R&R. Better yet, maybe you invite them to do it with you. And you invest in the friendship. You and your wife sit down and you say, you know, we're not wealthy by any means, but I think we can afford $40 a month that we're going to invest in sitting down and having coffee a couple of times with our best friends. And we're going to nurture those relationships, and that will be money well spent. If you prefer beer, as my wife was saying to open the service, as opposed to coffee, knock yourself out. She's not smiling. You follow me? How do you use what you have to invest in people? This is the first major point that Jesus wants us to get about our money. Your money is not to pay bills only. It is not to put food on the table only. Your money is an asset that you have to invest in people. I love, by the way, the last phrase of this first set of verses. It's timeless. It's eternal. I think of the people that I'll use my wife as the example. There are people that she has invested in relationally for years now. In some cases, a couple of decades. And sometimes it costs money for her to do that, for us to do that. She'll take a trip. She'll buy a plane ticket. She'll go someplace. One of her friends lives in the burbs of Washington, D.C., and every time she goes, it costs $300-400 for her and the kids and that family to go do things and see things. And it's not about the money that it takes. It's about the people building that goes on because of the money that we spend. We choose to invest in those relationships. And here's what I know for sure. Those people that my wife has chosen to invest in with her energy, her time, and yes, her assets, when they get to heaven, they're going to be really happy to see her. And I don't know who's going first. I don't know if it's going to be her friends or it's going to be her, but whichever one it is, when the other one gets there, there's going to be a big smile and a warm embrace waiting. Because people last and money doesn't. And all of this that you and I are doing together in community, in friendship, in giving and kindness, this is eternal. This is what heaven will be like. And that's why you should care more about people than you should money. And you should use the latter to invest in the former. Now here's another very hard, concrete, specific principle that Jesus wants to get across. He then says, after the first principle, whoever can be trusted with little can be trusted with a lot. Now, what's the little? What's a lot? He's about to tell you. If you can't be trusted with worldly riches, which is the little, then who can trust you with true riches, which is the lot or the big? What's the principle there? Would you like God to trust you and to use you spiritually in a powerful way in the lives of those around you? Then you have a choice to make. There is, in fact, an entry point to that being able to happen, and Jesus lays it out here. You have to be faithful with your money first. You see it? The true riches, according to Jesus, would certainly be things that we would associate with his kingdom, having an impact upon others for his sake, for being a person who is neighborly and generous and just, courageous and faithful and merciful, a peacemaker, someone who is non-judgmental. These are all things that Jesus associates with his kingdom. Someone who is willing to be persecuted for the sake of the right things. These are the true things in life that we all yearn to see in our own lives, and we want to put into practice toward others. These are the true riches. In order for that to happen, Jesus says we have to be willing to be faithful with the little that is our money, our assets. What do you think it means to be faithful with your money? Even those of you who may not know the Bible particularly well could probably spout off for me some words that you know the Bible says ought to be true of our relationship with money. Try not to live in debt would be one thing the Bible says about money. Try to be generous with your money. Try to, as the last couple of verses said, use your money to invest in people. Try to give some of what you have, whether it's money or surplus assets that you have, two of something that you have, give it to somebody who doesn't have anything. Give it to somebody less fortunate than you. Sure, you know that. Try to live simply. Don't live above your means. Be happy with less. Don't always need the new thing or the big thing, because it's a trap, as we'll get into in a minute. These are basic things most of us know the Bible says about money. Great. Be faithful to that. Because as you do, you're opening your life to far greater spiritual use and vitality. So you can evaluate churches this way. You should evaluate our church this way. We as a church want to be used as who we are with our stated mission. We want to be used in the lives of people to give them a community of neighbors, a place where they can encounter the Spirit of Jesus alive and well among a group of people, where they can be at ease and know that no matter who they are welcomed along with us in the journey of following Christ. We want that. This is who we want to be in the world. Awesome. Part of how we get there is to be faithful with our money. So says Jesus. And it's at this point when you realize that the typical American church gives somewhere between every year 2 and 3% of its budget to what's called benevolence, which is meeting needs, caring for actual people, that maybe we begin to understand why at least some churches struggle to have a spiritual impact on their people and the people around them. Because maybe they haven't figured out that if they started with reprioritizing what they do with their money, then maybe they would be used more or have more of an impact. So says Jesus. And that's how important it is for you and I too. I'm sure you want to see your family grow spiritually. You want to see your kids nurtured and raised into being earnest followers of Jesus. That's what I want for my 2 kids. I want them to see that they can have a positive spiritual impact on their friends, at their schools. I do. Guess what part of that starts with, according to Jesus? Teach them to be faithful with their money. Teach them to do what they should do with their money. Teach them to view it the way Jesus said we ought to view money. To put those principles into practice that the Bible makes very clear about money. So Jesus says, number 2, what you and I have to do if we're listening to him is, if we want to be people of spiritual importance and impact, then we need to start with a very clear, sober estimation of how we use our money. And I hope that you do that this week. Take some time to figure out where you can shift or adjust or reprioritize. And then the key is watch for what happens next. Let's take Jesus up on this wager. As you begin to take small, don't get it all right at once, just take a step in being more faithful about your money, whatever it is. It'll be different for you than it is for me. Find one thing you can do different. Then maybe a month from now, find another thing you can do different. And then watch what happens. Will you find that the second part of the equation begins to be more and more true. That as you get more faithful with your money and you handle it God's way, all of a sudden, He's using you more. He's giving you more opportunity to reach out to people, to care for people. You feel better. You're more at peace. You feel closer to Him. That's what hangs in the balance, according to Jesus. This is the third or last major principle that Jesus wants to get across in this parable of the dishonest manager. Now, if these verses sound familiar, that's because there's a version of these in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. Jesus ends by saying, "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Now, the branch devotional for this week covers this really well, so this is going to be the one I talk the least about. But Jesus is setting up here what they call in economics a zero-sum game. It's very simple. He says that the more you love and serve what you have, your assets or your money, the less you are going to be able to love God and what He wants you to be doing in your life. Add to one, take away from the other. Add to this one, take away from this one. The more you serve your money and your assets, the less you are going to be able to do that with God and His purposes and what He wants your life to be about. Now, I don't know about you. I'm going to go ahead and tell you my reaction to these verses. I don't like even thinking about being somebody who loves money. I don't even want to think that that could be true of me. And then, of course, I launch almost immediately into, well, maybe I love money a little bit, but let me go ahead and tell you about people that I know or who are in the media or in the headlines right now who certainly love money more than I do. But I think if you focus in on the words that Jesus chose to use, you can see the truth of what He's trying to say and the pitfall that faces us all. He uses these words: loving money and serving it, or you could probably even say it better, being enslaved to it. And I think I do understand what both of those look like or feel like in my own life. There are things that my income does for me that I do really love. I like having HBO. I am an HBO person. If I am going to watch anything on demand after I get home from work, it is going to be something on demand from HBO because I love their documentaries, I love their news stuff. It keeps me very well informed. Do I love it? I guess so. I don't know. I don't love it as much as I love my wife, thank goodness. But then I ask myself, how would I do without that? Like, let's say we're considering tightening our belt a little bit financially, and I need to cut that out. How would my life look? How would it be different? How disappointed would I be if I didn't have HBO? And then I'm going to go ahead and confess and say, I would be more disappointed than I want to tell you about if I didn't have HBO. And at that point, I don't know if that's the love of money, but I'm probably in the right zip code, right? What if you can't take vacation this year? How bummed are you going to be just because you don't have the money to do it? How much do you like the house you're in? How bummed would you be if you had to downsize for whatever reason? One of your kids needed help financially, and so you decided you'd downsize your house and you'd help them out. How bummed would you be? And on down the line. You understand, of course, we live in a culture at large that is addicted to money and what it gives you. So we are all at least susceptible to what Jesus calls here the love of money. And maybe you, like me, would say, okay, the whole love of money thing I don't know about, but the whole feeling trapped by it, that I do get. By how little I have, by how much I wish I could do that I can't, by what I can't afford that I wish I could, by what I can't do for my kids that I really wish that I could. I understand what it feels like to be trapped by my money, to be enslaved to it. I bet you do too. Jesus' point here is very simply this. wherever you fall in the love of money, enslaved to money, quagmire, that all of us as Americans in a materialistic culture face, all of it is a giant distraction from the thing that's most important, which is loving God and serving Him and being about His kingdom purposes in the world. And that I also understand. Because I know what it's like to worry about money, and I bet you do too. I know what it's like to worry about a job or how I'm going to pay my mortgage. I bet you do too. I worry about what I'm able to do for my kids or my family and what I'm not, and I bet you do too. And what I find is when I reflect on the amount of worry or energy that I spend on that stuff, it has taken away from my ability to care about the most important things, for my heart to be full as I try to love God and love other people. And I'll bet that's true for you too. That's what Jesus is driving at here in this last major point in his marvelous story about a dishonest manager. Let me tie all these 3 points together with these 2 quotes, which I think do a very good job of wrapping this all up. First, no less an authoritative voice than Billy Graham once said, "If a person gets his attitude toward money straight, it will help straighten out almost every other area of his life." Based on what Jesus said in Luke 16, that is undeniably true. Second, one of the most prominent Catholic philosophers and thinkers of our day is a guy named Peter Kreeft, and he writes this about possessions and money. "Possessions and money are necessary. Just try living without them. Sin enters the picture when we begin desiring these 2 things out of proportion to their true worth." That is exactly what Jesus was trying to say in Luke 16 about money and assets and possessions. Would you take a minute here at the end of the message and maybe allow God some space in your life to talk to you about which one of these unconventional ideas about money He'd like you to focus on this week. Maybe listen for Him to tell you a specific idea that you can put in place or a focal point you can have in the next 7 days. Because these are, if you're listening and you take them at face value and you take them to heart, these are unconventional ideas, meaning you and I don't come to these conclusions on our own. And so initially, even if just deep down, they can be very unpalatable to us, and we want to keep them at arm's length. Instead, how about right now, be open to living by these principles up on the screen, and let's just see how much it impacts your life and the life of your family, and of course the life of our church too, as we choose to live this way. Take a minute in the quiet. Let God talk to you, and then I'll pray for us all.